This keynote address is going to provide you with a brief overview of the sort of what I think is the most interesting pattern about girls and crime globally in the contemporary era, and that is the rising rates of violence recorded for girls, not just in Australia but in America, Canada, US. And these, I'm going to show you some data, but basically then I'm going to go into some arguments about that and some reasons for it. It's certainly highly contested, so I'm not suggesting there's any single answer. I'm not going to argue that there's any one foolproof reason either. But one view is that the narrowing of the gender gap is an artefact of simply shifting modes of social control and policy. Another view is that it's simply the fault of feminism, that it's feminists to blame because they've narrowed and brought women's and girls' behaviour in alignment with men's, and hence you would naturally see an alignment of their kind of capacity to commit violence. That's another argument which I'll go through. But there are two in particular that I really want to push today, and they're actually around the rise of two things. One, social networking, cyberbullying and girls' violence. I want to take you through some of the really cutting-edge research in that space. But I also want to talk about the rise of violent femmes and Facebook and the way in which these kinds of new forms of cultural deportment might just be influencing girls' capacity to engage and be rewarded for, in fact, committing violence. I'm going to argue quite controversially, and it's not unusual for me to be controversial, but I'm going to argue that even though feminism has been blamed for a lot of this, that their own silence and their own 40-odd years of feminist criminology have sort of latched onto the female as the victim, and has overlooked the capacity of female violence. And we really don't adequately have a feminist theory of violence. And I think that that's been at the core of a lot of the problems as well. Okay, so first off, for those who want to go to sleep during the data, go to sleep now and then you'll wake up later. Okay. I just wanted to start, of course, with the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. I'm very proud of the Juvenile Justice Minimum data set, having been there, in fact, signed. I was the one who negotiated the original contract with AJA, to generate that data set. I think it had enormous capacity, so I just wanted to start off with that particular data set. And of course, this relates to our previous speaker, that tragically, one of the most common contemporary features is in fact the massive overrepresentation of Indigenous girls in the system today. Now, this is a snapshot of today. Girls are around twice as likely as men to be proceeded against, 3 times more likely to be proven guilty, and about 4 times more likely to be in community-based supervision, and 5 times more likely to be in detention. It never used to be anything like that. That's the AOHW data, and that's represented in a different way. But this is what I really want to focus on. I've got a 52-year data archive now of juvenile justice data for one jurisdiction, New South Wales. So whilst boys still outnumber girls before the courts, and they're still double the number of those who are before the courts for violent offenders, that gap has narrowed absolutely significantly. It's narrowed very significantly, and I'll show you the data in a moment, from 14 girls to 1 boy in 1960 to 5 girls and 1 boy. That's about 4 to 5, about 13 to 14 in 2012. For those who read graphs, this is my 52-year archive. Of course, there are some data quality issues for you data quality nuts out there. Of course, there were some changes in counting rules coming from AOHW. I'm so aware of all those things. But at the end of the day, the gender gap has, of course, that's boys, of course, there at the top line. That's girls. And you can see this is 1960, this is 2012. So you can clearly see that the gender gap has narrowed very, very significantly over those 52 years. And you can also see that the peak, interestingly, for boys appearing before the courts in New South Wales was in fact in the 1970s. So for all those law and order politicians out there, it was the 1970s where you had your highest rate of young male offending in that state. But of course for girls it's been on a big increase there I think it was 1997 was the peak for girls. There has been a slight decline of both girls and boys in that jurisdiction over the last 10 years, and I will put that largely down to the success of the youth conferencing and diversion programs in that state, the ones that we've just lost in Queensland. Okay, I've just said that. One particular pattern about girls is that they are less represented, or boys become more represented as they ascend the hierarchy of punishments in the system, from conference to community supervision to detention. And this is just a screenshot of that particular pattern for juvenile justice in New South Wales. And you can see there, can't you, that there are more girls in community under youth conferences than there are sentenced to detention. There's only 11% sentenced to detention. Now that pattern is pretty similar in the AHW data for juvenile justice. It basically does show that pattern similar for all jurisdictions or most jurisdictions. But this is the kind of pattern I really want to focus on. And why is it that we have, when you just take out, and I've used finalised court appearances for most serious appearance, and they call acts intended to cause injury. That data collection starts in 1989, and I've been collecting it all those years. Yes, I'm getting old. Since I started collecting that data, they used to account for only less than 14%, 13.8% of girls who appeared before the courts were related to violent matters. When I first started collecting data, it was only 4%, but I haven't included that data collection here because it's not directly comparable, but that was 4%, and they were girls who appeared before the courts in the 1970s. So these girls who were before the courts in the 1980s, it had moved up to about 13.8%. But in the last round of data, it's over a third. So now over a third of all girls who appear before the New South Wales Children's Court are therefore acts intending to cause injury, so violent-related matters. Over the same time frame, male appearances for acts intending to cause injury, they have risen too, but they've risen from a much lower base than girls, 10% to 20-odd%. So 1/5 of all boys before the courts in New South Wales are there for violent-related matters, but well over a third of all girls are before the courts for violent-related matters. That's a very big gender difference. And that difference is global, and I'll go through some of the global. Now, what I've just explained there, that's the graph there for all those data nuts. And I love showing this picture to students because they always think the boys have got to be on the top, but no, it's the girls. The higher proportion of this is a proportion of girls at 4, and this is 1989 and this is 2012. So you can see there that it's risen dramatically. Once again, you had some outliers in 2003, 2004 due to changes in counting rules. I was tempted to delete those 2 years, but I left them in for another purpose, and I'll show you that later. Now, for all those sceptics out in the audience who want to say, oh, it's just one jurisdiction, well, it's not. The global rises in girls' violence have been reported everywhere, in the United States, Canada, UK, and they're large and they're very significant. There's an enormous amount of contention about them, and I'll go through some of the contention in a moment, and I'll go through some of the data. I'll let you read that, but basically it is absolutely unequivocal. And even though there's been lots of disputes about how you interpret it, there is now at least consensus that the global rates for girls reported violence is growing internationally. It's growing in all jurisdictions that have the internet, and I'll come back to that in a moment. This is the young female violent offenders. There was a big piece of research done by the UK over there, and it's clearly showing quite an increase in young female offenders in 2001, 2005. The data trend ends at 2005. This is the problem. You pick up reports and studies, they only do it for 5 years. I think I'm the only one who's been crazy enough to do it for 52. Well, why? Okay, why? So that's the data. So the consensus is these rates are growing globally, they're growing in lots of jurisdictions, but there's virtually no consensus after that. This is where it all ends. Now, there have been some who have wanted to interpret these rates simply by denying them or by silencing them. The most common response to in criminology as a discipline, for instance, is to simply ignore them or overlook them because violence is a capacity that we've always attributed to boys. So it's something that we haven't looked at with girls. And there's very, very little research on it, incredibly small amount of research. And what research there is done by feminists, and that research tends to, as I'll show you later, that research tends to explain these rises away as usually the product of social control, the product of statistical artefacts, the products of measurements. So there's been a long history of feminist research in criminology that's kind of erased or silenced or not wanted to really own the problem of women's violence or girls' violence, but really constructed women's violence in terms of a sort of an outlier. Women are mostly passive. Women are mostly conformist. Women are mostly non-violent, so therefore we don't look at violent women. The violent woman has been pretty much an outlier in feminist criminology as it has in others. But one of the main kind of responses I've just reversed the order here, has been to, since the sort of 1960s when the first kind of reports came out around women's rises in women's reports of women's crime and violence and girls' crime and violence, was just to blame feminism. And the Sisters in Crime thesis did that, and it basically theorised that as women's and men's became more equal, then of course you would necessarily assume that then girls and boys and men and women, that their offending profiles would sort of somehow or other come to collide or match or resemble each other. That was a very common response, and I would argue today that it's still probably, unfortunately, the predominant response, and it's still culturally very popular, and I think in the United States that response has had a resurgence, and I'll come back to some evidence there, which is all the more reason why I think it's so important for feminists to develop a theory of female violence. Okay. So the main shortcoming, I think, in refusing to engage with the fact that female sex can in fact be violent and are violent, is that it leaves completely uncontested all those anti-feminist explanations of female violence that circulate in popular culture and that are in fact growing, and they're growing in America, and don't worry, there'll be the Tea Party in Australia soon, the way politics is heading, and they're the major source, root and source, these Tea Party politicians, and I'll show you some of that later. Okay, so then the other main response to interpreting these is to say, well, you know, girls aren't becoming more violent, women aren't becoming more violent. That couldn't be the case because they are the gentler sex. Rather, it's really the regulatory responses to their violent behaviour that's changing. It's net widening. Now, look, I am, as many of you know, I would accept that net widening occurs. It occurs in specific contexts. And I think that there is a particular historical moment where the juvenile justice system sexualised girls' offences, and I'll show you that in a moment. I do think there is, in fact, a moment where that particular interpretation had a lot of purchase, but it's not now. I think it had that... I'll come back to this slide. Here. So I think this is my archive again. Well, it's an archive, my archive of the juvenile justice system. But here you can clearly see when we used to have welfare matters, and the welfare matters are for those who are old enough to know about welfare matters, in 1961, most girls appear before the courts for welfare matters, okay? The green is criminal matters. And of course you can see here, the green is just escalating right up to... The reason that ends at 1996 is because that's when we stopped policing girls for welfare matters. This is the demonstrative evidence that shifting modes of social control really does influence the ways in which girls are policed. Okay, so we did shift from using sexualising offences under welfare like uncontrollable, exposed to oral danger. We did that. We did that with abundance, and we did that with absolute gusto in the 1960s and 70s. Girls who went to rock concerts, girls who absconded, girls who were back on motorbikes, girls who were in any way morally reprehensible, sexually promiscuous. They could easily be drawn in under the net of welfare matters, as could Aboriginal kids, and that's an argument I make in my book as well. But my book that's from 1993, I mean, that very old book now. So this is demonstrative evidence that when you change laws, change policy, change legislation, and thankfully that happened in all Australian jurisdictions around that time, following suit after Frank Walker was brave enough to change it in New South Wales. This shows you that you can change the kind of patterns and ways in which, so modes of social control can change the ways in which the data is constructed and the way in which girls appear before the courts. However, I would say that that was in that particular period and we've come to an end. I don't think that works anymore. Okay, so going back to, I think there are two things I want to look at now. One is the way in which we've constructed violent women and girls as masculinised femininity. So we've now got a contemporary version of the Sisters in Crime thesis. It's no longer as simplistic as, well, you know, men and women's roles are aligning, so therefore their patterns of crime are aligning. It's a little bit more sophisticated. It's saying that, well, you know, youth violence is really the domain of boys. It's really a masculinised form of behaviour and conduct. It's something we associate with boys. That's a form of essentialism in itself, which I would object to. But anyway, that is very popular in criminology as well. Hence, the argument is that girls who are aggressive and they are just simply behaving like boys. So this is what we call masculinised femininity. And you see this represented in ladette culture. And of course, it's a contemporary form of just blaming feminism. It's a contemporary way of saying, once again, it's all feminists' fault. And of course, he's Big Brother. This is just a straight out, I didn't write that. That's come straight off Big Brother's website. What feminism is giving us now? Ladettes. You know, so if you type into ladettes into a Google web search, you will find them accusing feminism of giving us all these masculinised women who behave like working class, foul-mouthed yobs. So they drink, they swear. They often love to blame Patsy and from Ab Fab. Now, Patsy appeared on the front page of this news story in 2000. Just recently, she appeared next to this picture of a young ladette, you know, drunk on the floor, in the gutter, being picked up, stilettos ruined, you know. So, and it was interestingly, this sort of whole kind of, well, you know, the sisters, the feminist sisters, those terrible, you know, the lookalikes from Ab Fab, they're the ones who gave young women the role model to become ladettes, foolish, drunken, working class women who are tough, smoke, swear, fight, drink, disrupt, rude, and they're open about sex. Okay, so... But there's something else that's happened, and this is a more recent dimension, and that is representations of masculinised femininity have also now become caught up in a whole kind of popular culture and the seduction of the violent femme. So ladette culture is now spilling over into all these media and cultural representations of women who are violent, girls who are mean, bitchy, rude, manipulative, and there is just an abundance of it in sort of popular television, the press, everywhere. And what's very interesting about a lot of these sorts of representations is that, once again, they try to construct it as girls acting like boys, as it's really masculinised femininity, whereas I would argue that, in fact, it's not masculinised femininity, and others have argued this, that it's, in fact, girls, in fact, exploring a completely different cultural space, exploring a whole new way to be mean, exploring and appropriating aggression as a form of a kind of a contemporary form of adolescent female identity. So it's really about the recreation of cultural feminine identities, not about just acting like boys. But much of the locus of anxiety has been focused in public culture around the violent femme, because the violent femme is both. She's mean, she's tough, she's rude, she drinks, but she's also very violent and she's also very sexually seductive. Okay, this was another front page story. There's been hysteria around the world about ladettes. What's wrong with Britain? Drunk chicks. Okay, here we go. Here's the ultimate violent femme, Lara Croft. There are Lara Croft lookalike sites. There are Lara Croft groups. There is Lara Croft's everything. And so these kinds of, there's this sort of fantasy construction, spooks, all those spy movies you watch. They're always gorgeous, glamorous, stunning, sexually seductive women, and they wear their guns like, hipsters into their stockings, So this is this sort of highly kind of, there's almost a masochistic, sort of sadomasochistic element to this. And when they shoot from their stockings, not from their hips. So as you can see, it's from the stockings, girls. No, so no longer are they there to hide the legs, they're there to hold your guns. So we have these, and then we have these Lara Croft, we have all these kind of video games, it's endless. And we have all these kind of Lara Croft lookalike sites. That is a Lara Croft lookalike. And they go and they compete, they take photos of themselves, they rate it. The one on the right is real, the one on the left is a game. But they don't look too, you wouldn't know, would you? So you get this blurring of fantasy and reality, and of course, it's not, it wouldn't be unusual for an adolescent girl to live these parallel worlds, because they do. They're the first generation that live a parallel world. And I'll show where what's their life in social networking on the internet is very much mingled with their everyday parallel world life, and it goes in a very sort of complex way. Okay. Now, so this is the kind of other main argument I want to run, and this is about girls' violence, cyberspace and online social networking. All right, there was the most recent kind of online survey of young people, mind you it's American, but it was it's a random survey of over 1,000 teenagers who use the internet. 9 out of 10 use social networking, 3 out of 4 have a social network profile, 1 in 5 has a Twitter account, I only got one last week, 8 out of 10 have a mobile phone, and interestingly, while most of them say that they have a positive experience on the internet, that they can't live without it, it's an integral part of their world, a quarter, no more than a quarter, said that they wish they were born in a world without Facebook. They wish they were born in a world, because it's so much part of their lives. It's like, the old argument about compulsory heterosexuality, or it's compulsory social networking. You can't get out of it. Now, very interestingly, the girls surveyed, many, many more girls surveyed than boys, expressed much anxiety around how the internet was used to defame them, and it's interchangeably used with the mobile phone, taking photos, taking videos, uploading, tagging them, and it's about how friends use these social networking technologies to defame other girls, to exercise power. And of course, what these girls were most frightened of was them having a very unflattering image, like them sitting on a toilet or them bending over or something, posted on the internet and then tagged, and then it being sent around and posted on YouTube. And that is what happens. Now, interestingly enough, when I first did a search for these fighting tips, girls fighting tips in 2009, there were 41 million. Now, it's 48 million. But girls fighting at school has gone from 37 million to 142 million. These are enormous. That's just the number of sites on Google. Girls fighting youth truth, there was 24 million in 2009. Now there's 102 million girls fights loaded onto YouTube. Girls fight videos, there was 73 million in 2009. Now there's 567 million. And I'll just show you one in a moment. Can you show it to us? Now, I'm just giving you the best of girls' fights here. There's nothing fake about these, they're real.
I totally look like a boy. Jerk.
Okay. Now, there's another 570 million of those on YouTube if you want to watch them. If you've got, but they're a whole cult. Now, the other thing that's happened is there are Facebook sites just for girls' fights, lighting girls' fights, taking them, lighting them. This page has over 11,000 likes. Over 11,000 likes, but there's some that have thousands more. Uh-oh, what's happened? Okay, lots of likes for all those fights. And it just scrolls down and there's just millions. This is why, and you become a friend of this page and then you can go out and upload them, and et cetera, et cetera. So absolutely millions, millions and millions. And there's thousands of likes for these pages. And even pregnant, this is in fact one I found of a pregnant girl who had a fight uploaded of her fighting, and it was called the Pregnant Girl Fight. But this is what I want to get to. Okay, so quite clearly, I'm not suggesting that there's a direct correlation between the rises in girls' violence and necessarily the way in which the internet creates a whole new normative, unregulated space for normalising and rewarding girls who fight. They get a lot of reward for posting those fights, and in their own subcultural worlds, it's really cool to be mean. So the more likes you get, the meaner you are, the better you are. Okay, so that's kind of what's going on there. Now, I'm not suggesting that there is a direct relationship, but it'd be almost impossible, I think, to deny that there would be any relationship whatsoever, given that they are using mobile technologies to take these, inciting the violence, and then the internet and the normative culture around that is rewarding it. So basically the lesson from that is girls can be violent. Feminists have, though not all feminists think that, but some feminists who certainly want to construct the female sex as not having a capacity for violence are completely wrong. And if there's anyone in this room who now thinks that girls can't be violent, there must be some, I would hope that you can't possibly think that after seeing those. And if you're still a cynic, just go and have a look at the other 57 million of them, 57 on the internet. So I would suggest that there's nothing inherently gendered necessarily about fighting or aggression. It's really the context that are gendered. But I do want to sort of talk about now why we really do need a feminist theory of violence. Because when the violent femmes descend from the Laura Crofts, and Laura Croft becomes Lindy England. Now, this Lindy England was the prison guard. You must all know that there was just enormous number of the times these photographs were circulated around the abuse and torture and atrocities and the sexual humiliation of the prisoners at Abu Ghraib in the War on Terror. Now, she was she was sentenced for 3 years. At the time, she was constructed as a hate figure in American culture. And here's just 3 of the images. And she was very much constructed as a ladette, and she was even called a boy-girl. But so this is the violent femme, and the really real violent femme in the real world, not the Lara Crofts. Okay, very interestingly, and here she is engaged in sexual humiliation of the prisoners. The one where she's got the fag hanging out the side of her neck, she's like a hooker, she's like a ladette, and she's actually pointing a finger at a prisoner who's been forced to masturbate. That's sort of been blurred out in the photo there. But it was deliberate sexual humiliation. But of course, who is to blame? It's again the same discourse. It's always feminism. Now, this is the Tea Party. So Phyllis Schaefer, who's a conservative member of the Tea Party and author of Feminist Fantasies, complained that after complaining these are a worldwide national disgrace, they brought humiliation to America, she then went on to blame Clintonista feminazis for what? Feminising the military. So once again, you have these bizarre kind of arguments that the rise of women's violence, women who are violent in the military, women who are violent anywhere, it's always feminists' fault. And so then she goes on, I'll let you read that there, but she's basically saying feminists have encouraged women to be violent towards other men, and then to put these violent videos on their wall up there or whatever as a sort of a form of trophy. Well, I mean, quite frankly, that apart from the fact that no feminists came to Lindy England's defence. She was as much abhorred by them. Why? Because she represented the violent femme. She was a real version of what feminists always, I think, have feared, that there are women who are violent and can behave in violent ways. But my argument is that if you have if you do have a feminist theory of violence that in fact takes into account, and I'll show you in a moment, if you have a feminist theory of violence that takes into account the context, it takes into account and owns the problem, but it looks at the politics, it looks at the power, it looks at the context, it doesn't construct essentialisms around that violence, that somehow or other women don't have that capacity or girls don't have a capacity to be violent. Then you can start to explain what happened to Lindy England. And in fact, if we go back to Lindy England was in fact under orders. We now know, only from the 2010 leaking of the torture memos, that in fact they were under instruction. That was her defence at the time, that she was under instructions by her superiors. And we now know from those memos actually said they actually did instruct sexual humiliation of those male prisoners in that prison, Arab prisoners, was in fact contained in the torture memos as in fact an instruction to those prisoners. So of course, once you've got the context, once you've got the politics, it had nothing to do with the fact that she was a woman, but she certainly had the capacity like any woman would, but it was the context in which that violence was unleashed. Yes, there was all this kind of sexual innuendo because Grainer, who was the supervisor, was also her lover. So there was all that kind of stuff around the side about the lover and the torturer, this kind of sadomasochist sort of SMM type narrative that fitted around these pictures. But interestingly enough, they had thousands of other pictures of prisoners being tortured by men. But this image and these images of her were such they were an amazing decoy. What do? They constructed a decoy from the activity of the CIA, the activity of the agents and the Bush administration, and it's in fact memos and torture. So once you actually start to look at the context, the specifics and the reasons, you can start to unpack these things, I think, in a much more explicit way. So I think, once again, most studies suggest that violent women and girls, they might know a lot of F words, but one of them is not feminism. Most studies suggest that they're more traditional, tend to be more traditional, that they tend to not even know what feminism is. So coming back to my final point then, can there be a feminist theory of female violence? Now, for a long time, feminists said no, because women aren't violent. It's not a capacity for violence. And there's been a lot of debate about that. Why should we construct a theory of violence? Aren't we just, playing into constructions of violence that are heterosexual? So, but I would say yes, we do. And I think that some of the reasons for the power of the Tea Party, the power of that kind of popular narrative, and it pops its head up for the last 50 years. Every time the issue of women's violence, girls' violence, anything pops up, feminism pops out to be blamed. It's a decoy. It's a very convenient decoy. So, and I think, unfortunately, feminism has allowed that space to be occupied by very conservative constructions of women's violence as doubly monstrous, triply monstrous, because they themselves have tended to assume that women can only be victims. So interestingly, I forgot to mention this before, when you look at the victimisation data, the victims of young girls who are under 18, then their victims are primarily, nearly always, other peers and other female peers. That changes. The pattern of victimisation of women, and this is something being completely overlooked by feminism, is that girls beat up on other girls. Then, when they turn 18, the pattern does change, and that's when predominantly women are the victims of male partners or ex-partners. So it's only been that pattern that's been subject to enormous amounts of feminist critique and interrogation, analysis and theory. It's this other pattern that I'm suggesting has been silent, denied, overlooked. And it is time for us to, I think, develop a feminist theory of female violence that really does seek to address these issues in a sophisticated way. And so I just want to finish with one point. Because if feminism wants to be relevant, if it wants to have some influence in public cultural and political and criminal debates about the heightened and, yes, often exaggerated, taken out of context, social concerns about women in the military who are violent, around women who are violent, around girls who are violent, around girls who use the media, the social networking to be violent, then their silence is not a strategy for any kind of success for engagement. Thank you.